stragglers. Hello, good evening. I hope you can hear me. I know I was told to wait for some stragglers, but we cannot wait any longer. Good evening. My name is Sasha Craddock, and I'm the president of AICA-UK. And I really want to welcome you to our annual lecture, which we take very seriously. Before Dominic Czetowski, I try and get that right every time, who's a member of the AICA executives, fantastically authoritative introduction to our illustrious speaker, Lisabeth Lebovici, I really want to tell you about AICA and what we stand for. I'm going to be very straight, no jokes. I want to tell you very briefly. So, and when I've done that, I'm going to thank some of the kind people who've made this evening possible, enlightening, and I hope enjoyable. So, AICA-UK is the British section of AICA International. Founded in Paris in 1950, it is well represented in all AICA International. It's represented in all parts of Europe, Australia, North and South America, and the Caribbean. It has active national sections in Middle Eastern and Asian countries, and a number of African sections have been formed in recent years. Its main objections are to promote art criticism as a discipline and contribute to its methodology, to protect the ethical and professional interests of its members, to maintain an active international network for its members with available technologies, but especially encouraging face-to-face encounter, to contribute to mutual understanding of visual arts and aesthetics in all cultures, to stimulate professional relationships across political and economic boundaries, and important, to defend freedom of expression and thought and oppose arbitrary censorship. Okay, that's a big ask, but that's what we're trying to do. So I would like now to welcome or thank Anicia Morel, Cultural Counsellor, French Embassy to the United Kingdom, and Director, Institut Français du Royaume-Uni, Louise Cambeau, Assistant to the Cultural Counsellor, Dragoslav Zakarviev, Deputy Director and Audiovisual Attaché, Thomas Bregion, Cultural Attaché, and Faustine Palais-Beauchamp, Visual Arts and Design Manager. And from the ICA, Bengi Unsal, the Director, Amelia Martin, who was the former head of Learning and Engagement, and Hannah Geddes, Talks and Engagement Lead, who's here, and also all the ICA staff. And also, I'd like to thank our executive committee, and really to introduce Dominic Czetowski, and who will give our introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha. Good evening. I think it's a great honor for me to introduce today's speaker. I think actually the room is full of friends, colleagues, collaborators, so hardly any introductory notes are needed, but I will offer just a few. So Lisabeth Lebovici is an art historian, art critic, freelance writer, and lecturer based in Paris. She studied philosophy and art history at the University of Paris and moved to New York in 1979 to join the curatorial independent study program at the Whitney Museum. There she began her PhD in aesthetics, which she completed in 1983, and she lived through the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Upon return to France, she was the chief editor of Beaux-Arts magazine between 1986 and 1990, and she worked as the arts and cultural editor for the left-leaning French daily newspaper Libération for 15 years, from 1991 to 2006. As an AIDS activist in the 1980s and 1990s, Lebovici joined highly active groups in the fight against the invisibility and extreme negative representations of HIV-positive people. She was a member of ACT UP Paris, and the first president of the LGBTQI Paris Film Festival. She is an archival research member at the Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir. Between 2006 and 2024, she co-curated with Patricia Foliguer and Natasha Petreshin-Bacheles a seminar titled Something You Should Know, Artists and Producers, which was at the at École des Autres Études et Sciences Sociales in Paris. And also, since 2006, she's the author of an influential and I would say effervescent online blog, Le Beau Vice, The Beautiful Vice, which is a play on her last name, in which exhibition reviews, artist obituaries, and discussions around current social and political events are approached through a historical and theoretical exigency combined with deep personal commitment. Over the years, embracing activism and artistic practices and the relationships between them, Lebovici has woven a history of feminist and dissident art that diverges from the dominant narratives of patriarchy. In her research, books, and lectures, she has explored the articulation between feminism, AIDS activism, queer politics, and visual arts to present new ways of thinking about contemporary culture. Since the 1990s, she has contributed to numerous books, monographs, workshops, and conferences on contemporary art, gender and queer studies, as well as she contributed to magazines such as Art Forum, Iflux Journal, and Radical Philosophy. She has written on the work of Claude Cahun, Louise Bourgeois, Marc-Maurice Rowe, and Annette Messager, among many others. Her most recent writings has featured in books by or on Zoe Leonard, Wolfgang Tillmans, Felix González-Torres, Marlène Dumas, and Pauline Baudry, Renate Lawrence. With Catherine Ganard, Elisabeth co-authored A History of Women Artists in France between 1880 and 2000, titled Femmes Artistes, Artistes Femmes, which came out in 2007. Her most recent book, Ce que le sida m'a fait, What AIDS Has Done to Me, Art and Activism at the End of the 20th Century, was awarded the Prix Pierre Dax in 2017. In the book, Lebovici draws on personal experience to reconstruct the effects of the AIDS crisis on our ways of living in the world, interacting with each other, and representing ourselves. What AIDS Has Done to Me is a hybrid of art criticism and memoir told from inside the circle, and it links the process of self-making to the virus's effects on all artistic relations, scattering its titular me into a social mass. Restoring the voices of the friends and the fight against AIDS, articulating the I and the we of then and today, examining facts and affects little known to French and European publics, and analyzing the epidemic of consequential representation which followed the emergence of AIDS, such as the agenda of this book, conceived as a discourse of method in which the personal is always political, and public and private spheres are closely intertwined. The book was the starting point for absolutely magnificent exhibition called Exposé at Palais de Tokyo in spring 2023, which was curated by François Piron, with Elisabeth as a research advisor, and including work by more than 30 artists, collectives, and collaborators such as Hamad Butt, Catherine Opie, David Vonarovich, Michel Journiak, Zoe Leonard, Jessie Darling, and Nan Golden, to name just a few. The exhibition refuted the Western assumption that AIDS is an isolated epidemic from the past through new conversations between artists, dead and alive. It took on the way the epidemic blurred temporality, installing work via citation, association, and call and response. Accounting for the virus's effect on traditional forms of historiography, the show proposed a living history of the recent past that privileged the vitality and the urgency of the everyday. I think I'll finish here. Thank you very much, and welcome, Elisabeth.
Okay. A little bit of music. Oh. The music doesn't work. It's okay. We'll go. Okay. It was, thank you. So, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I'm a bit scared. My English is not so good, so I'm going to have to read maybe a very boring and long lecture. You'll see. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to AICA and thank you to ICA, which for me pronounces exactly the same, so I'm a little lost now. I was listening to your very, very nice biography, and then, as you know, I came up with this title, which is in sort of contradiction with this very beautiful biography that I don't recognize as mine, of course. My title is I Didn't See Anything. That's my bio. So for me, you know, to say that, it kind of oscillates between, indeed, all the misunderstandings, all the denials, all the disavowals that, you know, are my life. And then also the art historian's Daniela Haas's title, On n'y voit rien, one cannot see anything. And it sort of refers to what happens in Fra Angelico's Annunciation. With the angel, the invisible flies into the visible, and the unspeakable comes into the spoken word, constructing a material object that is both seen and not to be seen, but listened or meditated. So my meditation for today is going to be in 4 acts, in 4 parts, and with images. So if you please, let's buckle up and start. I didn't see anything. That's exactly what I said when I watched the retrospective of Thierry Vane-Damish's television programs. They were called Zigzag or Ping Pong, and they were in the 70s and the 80s. I watched this retrospective not so long ago. I think it was 2 years ago. And all these programs that Thierry Vane-Damisch devised for the television were art programs. There were film portraits of intellectuals, of artists, of cities such as Berlin, New York, Paris, exhibitions such as Paris-New York or Paris-Berlin. Programs devoted to men. I should add cis white men. Michael Snow, Etienne Jules Marais, Alexander Trauner, André Kertész, here, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jean-Pierre Faye. All the people speaking in these programs were men. Famous men talking about male artists. Great artists talking about male men. The only woman present appeared as mere decor. Even the great composer Germaine Taillefer appeared in the Paris-Berlin portrait like a trophy object next to musician Georges Auric, who lengthily detailed his music. I didn't see it then. We were so accustomed, we didn't see. We came from a cultural landscape constructed in the 70s by art historians in France, rethinking the academic discipline after May 68, with Althusser's notion of superstructures and ideology, Derrida's writing indifference, Foucault's discourse analysis, Kristeva's chora sémiotique, Freud and Lacan's understanding of the unconscious and its relation to language. I would read Lacan, La femme n'existe pas, but I didn't read Monique Wittig's radical reading of both Lacan and Simone de Beauvoir, when Wittig claimed that lesbians are not women, because she refused the heterosexual contract that makes women not born but becoming women. The discourse was constructed without feminism in France. In other words, without politics and practices of representation. These feminist interventions were practiced, nevertheless, on the other side of the channel, from here in the UK, where many studies on bodies and the body, the maternal femininities grew. Meanwhile, in France, art historians were going wild over annunciations. It appeared to me that in the UK, the same methodological tools were being used to rethink a practice of art history and criticism combined with, I'm quoting Laura Mulvey, a radical art practice that refuses to see artworks as purely objects in themselves. And Laura Mulvey added, its meaning only truly emerges if the work is put in by the artist, is complemented by work put in by the spectators in reading the documentation and understanding theories. So this is the first misunderstanding I'm trying to lay bare. On the one side of the channel, we focused on the functioning of the work. And on the other side, it seems that the focus was more on the social relation of the artifact to the spectator. So I want to take a case study relating to Lacan's mirror stage, very, very vaguely, to exemplify what I'm trying to say. I've tried to devise a chain of works and words that might bring us somewhere to the second, and then to the third, and then to the fourth part of my meandrous speech for tonight. You okay? You're understanding everything? Yes. Okay. Okay, good. 1. For Hubert Damisch, the inaugural moment of perspective, construction, Brunelleschi's supposed experiment, works like the moment of a mirror stage in painting. So you remember, on a small panel that can be held in the hand, Brunelleschi has painted his octagonal baptistery of San Giovanni. If you hear a lot about Florence, it's because I was just in Florence in a marvelous so I just have to put Florence everywhere. As seen from the central main portal of the cathedral with all its surrounding. Part of the panel is covered with burnished silver to reflect the sky and clouds. A small hole is drilled in the panel so that the viewer's eye can peer through the hole. With his other hand, the viewer holds a mirror. The perspective effect appears reflected in the mirror. 2. Caravaggio Narcissus. On the dark background, the painting is split horizontally by the dividing line between land and water. It is articulated vertically in Narcissus' relationship with his specular double. First, Hubert Damisch, same Hubert Damisch, notes that the two hands also constitute 2 points of junction on the surface of the water, sealing the figure of Narcissus to that of his double in a wheel. A figure of totality, but also of enclosure, yet not perfectly centered. Secondly, Damisch observes that the teenager's right knee, seen bare and in full view, occupies, along with its reflection, the pivot of this circle of illusion and of the half circle split in the mirror. The turgid knee, covered by garment with a slit down in the middle, signal the sexual phallic impulse that governs Narcissus, abused by his reflection. But, continues the art historian, this protruding limb, pointing dangerously in the direction of the viewer, can also be understood as a symbol of contact, of penetration of the surface, and perhaps here as much of the surface of the painting as of the watery surface. It refers to a mise en abîme where the viewer witnesses, through the canvas screen, Narcissus' intoxication for his double represented in the mirror screen. Again, the mirror. Okay, so I have to do a little manipulation. You're gonna, okay. And I go there. 3. Ah. Should I do it? It doesn't work so well. Help? Is there the Wi-Fi? The Wi-Fi is not working. No, it's.
I may have connected automatically to cinema too, so let's just switch it back to cinema one. Sorry, folks. Okay. J'espère que ça va fonctionner. Ça doit, ok, parce qu'on a connecté le Ethernet, donc ça devrait fonctionner.
Ouais. Okay. Well, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you should have seen, of course, Linda Benglis's tape. Now, do you wish to direct me? Rosin Krauss will later describe video art as a technology of narcissism. According to Krauss, video isn't only an electronic technology, it's a psychological situation that acts as a mirror stage, investing in the self. That is the condition of narcissism. So you should have seen that very famous video from Linda Benglis. Among Krauss's many examples in her Aesthetics of Narcissism, there is Linda Benglis's video, Now Do You Want to Direct Me? Krauss describes the tape of Benglis's head in profile, performing against the backdrop of a large monitor on which an earlier tape of herself doing the same actions, but reversed left and right, is being replayed. The two profiles, one taped live, the other tape, if I may say, moved in a mirrored synchrony with one another. As they do, Benglis's two profiles perform an autoerotic coupling drowned in the pool of the magnetic signal like Narcissus in the painting. So at the same time, Laura Mulvey in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema uses the concept of narcissistic identification to project it out of the surface of the screen onto the spectator's identification with an ideal ego image of masculinity. Narrative cinema offers the screen as its mirror to escape our own subjectivity while also reinforcing it. Again, we are here crossing the divide between the self-reflection of the work, its technology of narcissism, if I may say again, and a third part, posited in the frame but outside of the frame, subject and addressee of the gaze. Along the very loud noise that you were supposed to hear, you hear a verbal sequence composed of now, do you wish to direct me? Now, start recording, now. So, do you identify the four verbs? You should have identified the four verbs at the imperative: start, record, wish, direct. As one profile acts on the inverted other, performing a virtual mixing of tongues and mouths from images of several generations, do you hear the voice emitting the injunction, now? And the question, is it now? Rosin Krauss argues that, used as interjection, now, repeated in many layers by the lived and the taped source, is a substitute for the mirror reflection. But couldn't we also say that it mirrors the words of the biopowers and gender technologies that govern our bodies, work on them, press themselves to their surface, and link the most intimate pleasure to the pressing materialization of social demands? Mouths. Lee Lozano, Gloria Anzaldúa. To have a voice means so many things, from agency to elective procedure, from a texture of sound supposedly listened to by the infant when the infant sees nothing, or the enunciation of language. But mouths have also teeth and tongues, and many female artists have been playing with the polysemy of teeth and tongue. up to yesterday when I saw the Linder retrospective at the Hayward Gallery, Teeth and Tongues. With Lee Lozano, mouths stand alone, faceless, sarcastic, and toothless. In her notebooks, the American artist alluded to the rotten dental condition of New York artists. Many artists and writers like Lozano are committed to making open mouths and teeth, their bites, their ornaments, their decadence, a site of violently social and terribly intimate fantasies that resonate with those multiple modalities of the relationship to oneself and to others that we call the government of the body. I'd like to compare these devastated smiles with the words of the extraordinary Chicana thinker and activist Gloria Anzaldúa, who has used the metaphor of the mouth, tongue, teeth, orthodontics, the dentist, orality, and who writes in Spanish that of oral cavity is as la entrada de ajenas a la casa, the entrance of the aliens in the home. So, in Now, Do You Want to Direct Me? One can also hear an erotization of power in ritualized sexual practices, which are great consumers of scenarios and images. As art historians James Bowden and Ina Bloom have uncovered, Do You Wish to Direct Me is also addressed to Robert Morris in a game of video exchanges in which Benlis struggles to maintain her autonomy, not to be corrected by the male master. The video is her response, so that Morris and Benglis tapes together allow us in a glimpse into the emergence of a form of subjectivity born from technological mediation and identification with images that, rather than individuals, but which are also able to look at its failures and fissures, their bad teeth, their uncomfortable looks and sounds of grainy, deteriorated images, and words engulf into shrieking background noise. We're all being directed through several wars by a government whose us, US, does not include me. It was written in 2004, but I see it as written today. When I speak out loud and someone answers back, I feel my commitment to collective efforts. Perhaps this is where we can effect change. Sometimes when you call, what you get back is both an echo and response. The residual pleasure makes you want to call again. This is the editorial of the American review fanzine LTTR, which lesbians tend to read, lesbians to the rescues. I mean, it was an acronym that people could decode whatever they wanted to be. And it's interesting for me because it echoes Griselda Pollock's feminist intervention in art histories, where she draws the significant continuities between feminist art practice and feminist art history and criticism. I'm quoting Pollock. We are our own conversational community, developing our paradigm of practice in constant interaction and supportive commentary, she writes. The political point of feminist art history must be to change the present by means of how we represent the past. That means that we must refuse the art historian's permitted ignorance of living artists and contribute to the present-day struggle of living producers. This excerpt is dated 1987. In 1987, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, better known as ACT UP, starts in New York. The Paris chapter was founded in 1989. So I'm going to my second act of I Didn't See Anything, but before I want to show you a kind of update on all these mouths doing things. Let me again try. So you didn't have Linda Banglis, but you have Estelle Lab. To me, the most poignant contribution of a living artist to our chain of nows, and do you want to direct me, could be Estelle Lab, Welcome in Your Body, a 15-minute piece, video piece, accounting for a workshop initiated by Estelle with voice coach Myriam Djemour at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris I think last February. The participants were deaf people, or like Estelle, they are CODA, which means a child of deaf adults, who wish to open to their voice through vibration, through perceiving the circulation of air, through their muffling on screen and the resonance is in space. So, second act. I didn't see anything. That's exactly what my sister told me not so long ago after seeing the film 120 BPM and telling her sister that she hadn't seen what her sister was living with. Anyway. Dear Dr. Muller, I've got spider bites, mosquito welts, peeling, sunburned skin, salt water in my ears, sand in my crotch, burned feet bottoms, and sun-stripped snapping hair. What is the general cure for these beach problems? Signed, Frank. Dear Frank, this is really an easy one. Stay indoors and watch soap operas. Douse yourself from head to toe with watered-down apple cider vinegar to speed up the healing process of all these injured areas. Do this while watching All My Children. Love, Dr. Miller. Dear Dr. Miller, is it true that you can have syphilis for years and not even know it? I'm just so worried about everything as far as health goes these days. What with everything that's going around? Signed, Jonas Corona. Answer. Well, how did you contract this French disease? I didn't know anyone was still having sex. Things are getting serious in NYC. Everyone is scared for good reason. No one's exempt from getting the new epidemic, AIDS. All the doctors I've talked to have thrown up their hands. Could it be that it came from outer space or the State Department? What a great sci-fi novel it would make if there are any interesting authors left to write the book. That's the thing that's most disturbing and hardest to accept. It threatens to wipe out a good deal of their creative minds. From 1982 to 1985, Coco Miller, a writer, mother, outlaw, actress, fashion designer, go-go dancer, witch doctor, art hag, and above all, a goddess, for John Walters, writes a column in the East Village Eye. Ask Dr. Muller. She gave advice from homeopathic medicine to how to cut your cocaine with healthy substances. Each of them are hilarious, but very accurate as well. She also writes an art column, quite accurate too, at a moment, and I'm quoting her, where everything physical and tangible could be an art trend. Everything, food, clothing, shelter, water, tree, animal, sex. Now, if everything was art, she continues, then the sun would not stop above the East Village. It would travel normally. Coco Miller died of AIDS in 1989. In the 90s, I wrote for the magazine Self-Service in Paris an inventory of my closet as a critical column. My closet. So it began something like that. One of my obsessive and at the same time hated activities, no doubt inherited from my mother, is to clear out my bathroom closet every year. I still do that. This time, on a sleepless Sunday morning, I decided to tidy the stuff in my bathroom and to make an inventory, to take it, in short, out of the closet. So I went on and on and on and on and on. This is a chapter of my book. And I'm just going to read a few of those. So, nuancelle, a color rinse that gently untangles, gives a white-silver shade to light yellow hair discoloration. At the same time, since I stopped dyeing my hair, I don't need it anymore. I bought it in a professional shop in Cannes, city of the purgatory of blue rinsed permed hair. Siligase. The indications are aerophagia, bloating, flatulence, 2 capsules to be taken before or after meals. I don't know how many tablets to treat my inner fartophile. Before a radio broadcast on Radio Nova, we often talk about flatulence, fear from farting on the air. The psychoanalysis sessions are often conducive, if not to digestive noises, at least to their unspoken or spoken listening. Netox calms dry and irritating coughs, should not be taken by those with an asthmatic cough or respiratory failure. Infant glycerin suppositories. I was told that suppositories don't exist in Britain. In the UK, you have to tell me about that. Infant glycerin suppositories. Suppositories with glycerin. I always take the children's size. It's like I only need a half. It's more relaxed. Fungizone amphotericin B. Drinkable suspension, as they say so badly. My first contact with AIDS. The thick orange-brown liquid that Patrick put in his mouth, cracked white with fungus. Francis' tongue, Philip's tongue. Always that orangey brown, this bad taste in the mouth that annihilates the taste of food, the disease with the taste of fungizone. Okay, so this inventory could give a glimpse. This is another inventory by Guillaume Dustan, of what Jill Johnston called the disintegration of an art critic. Disintegration not only of its object, but also of its discourse, and also of its perspective, the eye in the eye. My response, much later, was to make an inventory of the violence of the predicament by using AIDS as a lens. It is through AIDS activism that I reconstructed an eye, precisely in not separating it from a radical art practice that refuses to see artwork as purely objects in themselves, as talked about in the first part of my speech. It was in the early 90s that I understood the concreteness and the abstraction of politics. Among its many powerful effects, the HIV/AIDS epidemics created a crisis of understanding about gendered and racialized identities, at least those that were in common in the West. As Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick once said, and as Craig Owens repeatedly uttered, a society that is homophobic is also a sexist society and a racist society. So I made a second coming out as a person being discriminated both by the patriarchal art world and by the invisibility of women, and particularly lesbians in HIV/AIDS activism. With activist writer and archivist Catherine Gonard, I began my work on the history of women artists in France, looking at their practice, their gender, their networks, sociabilities, and the evolution of their rights in France, which eventually led to Ce que le sida m'a fait, what AIDS has done to me, or how AIDS has done me. A me reduced to a mumbling, like you could have heard in Linda Benglis's Now. I would not be able to summarize it properly, and there are many more absents than presents, artists, shows, writers, even around the axis Paris, New York, which I chose because that's where I lived. I tried to work with my memory losses and my incapacities to remember, or with my misconceptions. Because when your friends are dead, you can't share and refresh your memories. You can't say, you remember when. You're alone. I couldn't stand being alone. So, rewriting a number of texts already written, I worked with my failures and what what I hadn't seen at the time or totally misread. This is actually what Greg Bordovitz chose to do in Image Virus, the book he actually wrote on general idea. Bordovitz reread his own reading, which was also the one of his activist peers of General Ideas project from 1987 to 1994, Image Virus, a project produced by a throuple of men who had lived together for 25 years. 2 died of AIDS in 1994, and 1 is a survivor. Using the word and design of Robert Indiana's love, and substituting to it the 4 letters of the acronym AIDS, General Idea declined, disseminated, viralized many surfaces, posters, graphics, objects, public spaces, gallery. But that substitution from love to AIDS has prompted the furor of certain activist groups, such as ACT UP, in which Greg Bordovitz had found a foundational voice. The continuity between love and AIDS was upsetting, as was incendiary in Paris, the publication by writer Hervé Guibert of To the Friend Who Didn't Save My Life in 1990. This book not only roused anger and fury within a community outraged by the idea that AIDS could ultimately constitute the meaning and intelligence of male homosexuality. This anger against the gay AIDS couple and against its matchmaker were the cause of a number of activist commitments in an effort not to let themselves be victimized. They didn't want to see the meaning of gay life entrusted to death. And this until they reread. Activists learned from rereading Guibert and understood their misunderstanding as a critical awakening. As a person living with HIV and an activist, Greg Bordovitz declares finding his voice in articulating both a subjective condition, the singular experience of living with AIDS, and the global condition for which the AIDS crisis is still beginning. And by these words, he incorporates the crisis ordinariness, a process embedded in the ordinary that unfolds into stories about navigating what's overwhelming, according to Laurent Berlant. The conjunction of the two can be achieved through language, viralizing both reading and writing into the practice of art as vital activities. And here is Greg Bordovitz, an AIDS survivor living with HIV, who starts writing about General Ideas Image Virus, and in the process, he makes a radical turnaround. 30 years or so later, Bordovitz says he was wrong, and how much now the political and poetical and emotional significance of such a project has appeared. By repeating the acronym AIDS far and wide, General Idea, he explains, is part of a modern poetic project emptying the word of all reality. Activist Paula Treichler has so aptly described the epidemics of signification that for more than 4 decades the word AIDS has raised. Even now, the notion of AIDS crisis or of the imminent end of AIDS are meaningless when pronounced by technocrats and managers who appropriate and reshape the awareness of a global fight. A fight, by the way, to which the Trump administration delivered a devastating and cruel blow in terminating its funding of U.S. aid in the joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS. This is what Image Virus touches. This is what Glenn Ligon's painting, I'm a Man, touches. Even more in its printed version that you have here, Condition Report from 2000. 2 side-by-side prints. One mirrors a version of Ligon's 1998 painting entitled I'm a Man. Both are reiterations of the protest signs carried by the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, during the height of the civil rights movement. The print on the right includes marks, scribbles, handwritten notations around the edges and borders of the image. They inscribe its condition report using the dispassionate language of conservators. Ligon actually asked a painting conservator, questioned by the multiple resonances of the words such as dark spots and brown smudges. The process of repetition and alteration embodies a marked physicality, the vicissitudes of time and the flow of history, and remind us that performativity is an act of repetition, a ritual of citation, flowing in a mental continuum between political and poetic action. But what matters to me, too, is the moving from one position, that of the actor, the actant, the activist, to another, that of the spectator, that of the reader. These are, incidentally, two forms of activity, one no more passive or thoughtless than the other. It seems to me that it is the passage from one position to another which has made my critical reposition impossible. It produced for me a kind of method that I found parallel to my looking back and operating a rewriting of my own texts with their condition report in a way that would form the chapters of Ce que le sida m'a fait. So I didn't want to write about AIDS or to write about artists who worked upon AIDS as subject. I always thought that writing upon is like sitting upon, which I don't like to do, as you see. Like the art historian or critic looking and sitting upon the art objects that I was talking about maybe in the first part of the book. I find David Getzi and Jennifer Doyle's conversation about queer aesthetics very relevant. You can find it in Art Journal in 2013. They disaggregate the relegation of queerness to always being about the political, about identity. As Candice Chu points out, aboutness is a predication of value, where a rubric like Asian American literature announces its subject matter as the Asian American rather than the literature. This essentialist categorization of so-fossilized and branded identities erases the feminist and queer attention to certain kinds of labor and attention, ways of working with things, that physicality, that kind of maintenance, sculptural housework, as Getzi and Doyle observes. So for me, writing with AIDS or in AIDS was reflected in all the missing parts, the losses, the silences that were present in text written from the late 80s, and that I actually didn't see. Working, for instance, with the terminable and the interminable, that was one essay that I wrote. With completion, decompletion, another essay. Considering Matisse's paintings as irritated derms, looking at the pruit of scraps and the influence of Polynesian tattoos, another essay with Philippe Pelletier. Working with affected machines, the technologies at hand both in the arts and activism, or with the death of the author at the age of the author's dying, or as I already read it, with my pharmacy closet, my ephemeral museum of the queer medicine ephemera in the age of AIDS and LGBTQ affirmation, working with fluidity and liquidity, or with dedication as paradigm shift. I'd been writing about works of literature and art that are addressed to someone, from Bardent Newman's brother in Shining Forth to Felix Gonzalez Torres' exchange of dedications with Ronnie Horn and his dying partner Ross, Untitled Ross versus Untitled for Ronnie. The idea blew me up that there was somebody or some bodies even at the end of the modernist straight line. These bodies were named as Nan Goldin gave everyone their first name in her pictures. Later, I noticed the extent to which they spoke in hollows of these interrupted lives, the work not yet produced, the lack, the despair, but also about rage, condensed time, vitality, and desire. Such seismography characterizes what I would eventually call the activity of art criticism. So a few years later, I became an addressee to, when the book became involved in an exhibition called Exposé, that you were talking about, a show dedicated to a book not represented within the exhibition, the exhibited work themselves, even abstractly, but I think more performed by these works. So this is my third act. I'm going to show you a few pictures of the show, and then which will enable me to drink a little bit. If we were alive today, he'd be standing next to you. If she was alive today, you'd be texting her right now. Summoning ghosts with whom we would live if they were alive, and who are dancing on the windows in a bilingual present conditional of the space of wallpaper. This is a work by Fierce Pussy. Belgian philosopher Vincent Debré has devoted 2 books to what the dead make us do. Au bonheur n'est mort, and more recently, Les morts à l'œuvre. Both start from an intuition. The dead engage the living to act. The modality of these actions are not defined by the dead, while they ask the living to satisfy them. It is a question of assuring the dead of a future. They insist, right, Debré? They insist, and they are able to do so because others have heard them insist. Sometimes those close to them, sometimes those far away. So the deceased, who pursue their existence by the grace of those who hear their call, become or dead in common. It is such insistence every day throughout the duration of the show, thank you, that we proposed, François Piron, the curator, and myself, to living artist writers as a terrain for them to act, to be in company, or even more, to take a figure from the text and let it circulate in another context. Like Moira Davy in dialogue with Hervé Guibert, Régis Samba-Kunzi and Julien de Vémy and Santu Mofokeng, which you saw before. Henrik Olsen and Philippe Thomas and Bastille and Guillaume Dustan and Barbara Hammer. I just put you the small drawing of wonderful work of Bastille we had in the show. Or Georges Tonistol with Dirk Jarman and Bruno Pelassi and Félix González Torres. Sorry. Or Nan Goldin's quintuple portrait of her gallerist Jules Duzin, together with Journiac's work, for whom Gilles Duzin had posed, and Virginia Arvitz, with whom Nan Goldin worked. Certainly not to commemorate, but to act by opening up other languages and by also being led to another place, like filmmaker Lionel Soucaz revisiting his 2000 Hours AIDS archive with Stéphane Gérard in order to do a film for his friend lover Hervé. Or Zoe Leonard revisiting her installation at Documenta 9, 1992, never exhibited since, because it involved working with the whole museum collection, which the Palais de Tokyo, which is like a Kunsthalle, didn't have. Or Fierce Pussy, who not only did for the record on the windows, but also opened their chapter 7 of Arms, Ache, Avid, Aeon, Nancy Brooks Brody, Johnny Pisala, Zoe Leonard, Kari Yamaoka, Fierce Pussy, Amplified. I was also dealing at the time with what I had not seen. My friend Tim Madescler-Joanny, who wrote for the catalogue, had just written an article about our common friend, William Baranès, aka Guillaume Dustan. You have Tim and Guillaume Dustan here. That also reread thoughtfully the heroic approach of AIDS and LGBTQ activists. As I already said, as activists, we were trying to destroy the love-AIDS couple as well as the AIDS-gay couple, seen as infamous for the community. But in this article, Tim pointed out how much this attitude also led to an unreasonable and destructive inter-community conflict surrounding bareback and HIV prevention around the late 90s, in which Guillaume Dustan was indeed the target. So instead of reading Dustan's text as inflammatory, Tim sees, on the contrary, he sees the text full of hope and confidence. Tim goes back to the two first books of Guillaume Dustan, Dans ma chambre, in my room, I think it is translated, and Je sors ce soir, I'm going out tonight, I think it is translated like that. One written just before and the second just after the implementation of multiple therapies treatment, but published afterwards, which undoubtedly confused the issue at the time. In the first novel, Dustan channels hope that comes back through the left leg. I felt it. The body, a site of pleasure and disease, remains as well a possible site for hope, a bodily hope that stays present throughout Dustan's first novel. Tim returns to the way Dustan describes his evenings at the gay tea dance in Je sors ce soir. He insists on the brevity of the verbal exchanges there, as well as their intensity. Ça va? Yes, I'm fine. That says it all. This account of a serious furtiveness is to be linked to what Michael Pollack, the sociologist Michael Pollack, has defined as liminal experiences, the survival techniques developed and shared by people with HIV. That can be interpreted as the beginnings of what would later be called empowerment, peer transmission, or lay expertise, the foundations of self-support and harm reduction. About Tim, his close friend, Dustan doesn't write very much, just once or twice. He calls him Tom, and about Tom, he notices how therapies show on the bodies. As Dustan says, it's amazing how much energy it gives them. This small sentence for Tim is a way of meaning hope is there. And Tim adds, the essential was that we were alive and that we would see each other again. Isn't it what a number of artists living with AIDS have proposed, offering their work to the unpredictability of the present? Look at Felix González Torres' works. They only come into being when someone takes their production in charge and decides of their installation, so that the exhibition is their becoming, a present form that goes beyond its presence, destined to mutate constantly like a virus, according to its condition of existence. So Jesse Darling says that when he was 40, he realized that many of the people he would have liked to claim as queer lineage hadn't reached their 40s. His approach in the show was a response to the paradigm where death is made invisible, canonized, and removed from the scenario of the living. So he requested from the Palais de Tokyo to gather all the remnants of all the recent Félix González Torres' exhibitions in Paris, Frankfurt, Bordeaux, etc. That is, the candies, the electric bulbs, the pearls made for the show but not used. Such remain that were also surplus and weren't supposed to officially exist anymore, thus entering a social, physical, and archival death, to quote Jessie Darling. After a collective peeling of the candy wrappers done by everyone on the premises altogether, myself included, all these were poured, light bulb pearls, also bureaucratic debris and administrative debris from the Palais de Tokyo itself, into large containers. I think the budget of the show was sort of taken out of the two containers. They were the size of Félix González Torres' untitled Orpheus Twice, 2 mirrors side to side, back to Narcissus, back to the mirror stage. Darling's intervention wasn't only thwarting the funerary conditions of the work of art through an operation of transubstantiation, it was also a monument, I'm quoting him again, to the thousands of artists, artist aspirants, people whose writing could have helped us think about the art lost to AIDS, as Darling said. For every Wojnarowicz and González Torres who have been taken up in the post-AIDS mainstream as exemplary martyrs, these were surplus, anonymous people with no galleries or foundations to preserve their names or legacies. And, I'm quoting Darling again, it is their loss that I feel most keenly today. People who took time to develop a practice, who left before anyone could see their work, people who didn't live in New York or Paris, people who were ambivalent about high art, people who worked in do-it-yourself scenes, whose living chaos was anathema to archives, people who were already too sick to continue working when the virus found its name. Like all of Félix González Torres' portraits, Untitled Portrait of Julie Ault is a series of event dates. They've been initially devised with the addressee, but they are also subjected to change over time, and the right to change dates and events is passed through the lending process to an institution and to persons like the curator, for instance. Untitled Portrait of Julie Ault have gone through several transformations since it was first made. One was a complete restructuring. On another occasion, Julie Ault had asked her mother, a telepath, to select the elements by using a pendulum. Julie Ault also extended her rights to the Palais de Tokyo to add meaningful event dates. These were devised during a very emotional workshop of 2 days by 5 people amongst a group of longtime survivors of HIV/AIDS who worked with Isabelle Santis, an art therapist also living with HIV. Each devised their own dates events in French that were integrated in Untitled Portrait of Julie Ault. The bilingual structure of the piece was maintained and arranged in a continuum so that a singular person portrait is the portrait of a group, each of them being also the subject as well as the addressee of the portrait. Some refer to it as my work. This is a public lecture they actually gave. Some refer to it as my work in the exhibition. One called her parents, from whom she'd been estranged since telling them her HIV diagnosis, asking them to come to see my work, as she said to them, at the Palais de Tokyo. And this was totally foundational to me. That was the room for the talks and the workshops. So 3 people. It was not recorded. Nothing was recorded, but people were actually drawing on this space, and with chalk. So every time there was a talk, they would erase and put, order portrait and order quotations. So it became a kind of palimpsest of everything that had been taking place in terms of lectures. We were very proud of that. We were proud of the show, but we were also proud of the outsides of the show that we liked very, very much. So that's my third act. During COVID, and particularly during lockdown, I was drawn to devise a project that would involve artists' friends and their practice, the materiality of it, in the studio. I wanted to observe my artist friends as technicians, as connoisseurs of their work, but I didn't want to interview them, to hear about intentionality. I wished to experience something with them. Doing something with someone is not looking or talking about. I was particularly exalted by Bruno Latour's fieldwork, spending time in a Californian institution specializing in endocrinology research and using an empirical approach to describe how scientific knowledge is made or constructed in a laboratory environment. In their study, Latour and Volgar refer to the slow, practical material process by which reality is made and not exterior to this process. I also thought about Marion Milner's not being able to paint, where she chooses as the object of her scrutiny not the professional and recognized artist, but herself as a Sunday painter, not the finished masterpiece, but her own fumbling and amateurish beginner's efforts to draw and paint, analyzing, in short, the all too common and distressing restriction by which the creativity of the average adult individual is held in check. I'm not finished with this project, and I can't say what it's going to be, but for the moment I'm fascinated by the way each of the classes and of my teachers built an art of memory that doesn't need to be recorded but actively retraced. I go through the technical operations that we've been through together so that the path we followed doesn't lead to a secret unveiled, an ultimate meaning of the work, but on the contrary, as a description of a path that is a practice. And that's my next act, is my last act. So a little bit of that. Of course, it's very small, so I don't see anything. I'm not seeing anything what I'm doing, tell you the truth.
Really? Yeah.
I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything. That is what I said. When a journalist asked during her investigation into a notorious artist who I knew a little and on whom I had written a little bit. Since this question and my answer, I've never stopped wondering. It was often that this artist presented himself surrounded by young boys. A prolific body of his work prospered on the solitary torments of childhood, particularly with his trembling writing. The words bitterness, we're happy, a taste for nothing, dance, first drawn by young boys of his choice, were appropriated by the artist and reproduced in named letters. Wasn't this tremor of enunciation perhaps pointing to some kind of clues? Was it a call to see? In 2019, a complaint by the artist Laurent Follon against the artist Claude Lévesque opened a judicial inquiry into rape and sexual assault of minors under 15. In 2023, following two other complaints, these were not time-barred, the artist was charged with rape of a minor under the age of 15, rape of a minor by a person with de jure or de facto authority over the victim, and sexual assault of a minor under the age of 15 by a person with authority. A petition launched by the French art magazine Art Presse in 2021 supported him, arguably for the fact that he was presumed innocent. Following an astute position pointed out by writer Gisèle Sapiro, which calls for the protection of intellectual freedom, Art Presse denied the accusation, as Claude Lévesque did. Today, it's exactly today, Libération is disclosing the first of a series of 3 investigations about the Système Claude Lévesque, where people actually speak for the first time about 40 years of a system of sexual harassment. In a number of well-known media, like Mediapart, Libération, Le Monde, lengthy investigations concerning sexual and sexist violence, mainly in cinema, more rarely about the arts, are being conducted, and I don't see anything, are being conducted. Extension of investigation to culture, often with a firm resistance for the cultural critics. For more than 1 year, and until last week, the French Parliament, following actress and filmmaker Judith Godrèche's demand, audited largely people from the cinema and live art worlds, but not from the visual art world. So for the past years, every day on Instagram, as you can see, Me Too Contemporary Art is publishing anonymous accounts of sexual assault, violence, harassment, racism, classism, and homophobia in the world of contemporary art and art schools in France. I'm becoming aware of my blindness. Last Sunday, there were 238 testimonies posted on Instagram. When I read these nameless testimonies, I know who it is. I know who it is not because I can identify the person, but because I've heard it once, twice, 12 times, 100 times. The history of feminist thought has constantly reaffirmed that the personal is political. In other words, the home, private life, but also domestic work and sexual and racial division within the economic world, which includes the gallery, the office, the workshop, the museum, and so on, are part of historically imposed and eminently political relations of power, in which forms of violence are exercised. Because they are denied, the violence against women, black women, women living with disabilities, or minors remains possible. The patriarchal regime is particularly manifest in the confusion between intimate and professional spaces, starting at school and extending to institutions, museums, and non-profit spaces. Why haven't we acknowledged the existence in the field of arts of a system of converging discourses, beliefs, and representations tending to excuse or minimize sexual abuse? Why didn't I, as an art critic and as an art historian, raise this question before? Why haven't we explored the violence that arises when artists, curators, critics, or institutions reduce others to fictionalized objects in the service of their own desires? In France, instead of doing that, we were faced with a response that was called the Deneuve Appeal, although Catherine Deneuve didn't write it. Published in the newspaper Le Monde, the text was signed by 100 women, many high-profile professionals from the arts, curators, artists, arts magazine directors, and writers. This text argued in favor of male freedom to disturb, to annoy, in French importuner, as indispensable for sexual freedom. It mainly showed how attached is the field of the arts in France to the bourgeois ideal of male genius and his sexual freedom for the exclusive use for those who have power. The text conformed to the fiction of a conflictless world and of an individual freedom that never concerned social relations. Freedom was converted into a substance that one can possess or not, while the demands emanating from those who have pointed out the constitutive relations between sexuality and power were wiped out. According to this understanding of an inner and unassailable freedom, there are no social relations or conflicts, and agency is a matter of individuals only. It's still being glued to the art worlds and to discourses about art that emanate from the media, freely using myths transposing creation into the marble of Pygmalion, for instance. In the realm of film, this concept of freedom has been strongly attached to the cinéma d'auteur, an aesthetic, coherent moment in French cinema criticism, with Les Cahiers du Cinéma, for instance. This critical moment, according to feminist academic Geneviève Cellier, has sacralized the figure of the artist, a male figure playing out the relationship of control and abuse of power existing between the young actress, essentialized as a singular, and the filmmakers. In her book, Le Culte de l'Auteur, she analyzes a quite large number of scripts. But how can we make room for the conditions under which works are produced without giving up on talking about forms and aesthetics? What can we do with works that we once loved, but which today seem to convey problematic imaginaries and dominations? It's not a question of censoring works of art, but rather of lifting the censorship that focuses on the conception of art as fundamentally alien to social relations. In other words, we can no longer be deaf nor blind to the conditions of production of an artistic work, its making, as well as its public dissemination, its lineage, its heritage. How does one write about Mazan, asked philosophers Manon Garcia, who attended the days and the days of the Mazan mass rape trial. For decades, as you might have read, Dominique Pellicot and 50 co-defendants repeatedly drugged, raped, and had raped his own wife, Gisèle Pellicot. For decades, he filmed, collected, kept, and distributed footage. How does one describe the videos with the words that translate the horror? How, in short, not to make porn when one only wants to describe violence, horror, domination? How not to make of a description a matter of excitement? This matter is important to us as art critics, or better, as art workers. I wish to use this word of art workers to describe a coalition of artists, curators, museum and gallery staff, teachers who reclaim better work conditions and a less competitive art world, refusing any form of discrimination towards women, people of color, trans and non-binary people, people with disabilities and other marginalized populations. To me, this coalition, parallel to the Me Too movement, contests the division still in use amongst media between a culture department, the reign of aesthetic criticism, and investigative journalism in the field of cultural affairs, the domain of the social. This polarity strongly respects the separation between work and creation, which often means creators, authors, auteurs. I remember one of my former colleagues talking about the plumes of Libération, the good pen, the plume of Libération, the good pen among which, obviously, I wasn't. In French, large audience media like Libération or Mediapart or Télérama have opened a space for cultural investigation touching cinema, theatre, dance, sometimes the visual arts, like today. More than often, for instance, in Le Monde, there is an open conflict between the culture department, still strongly closed about any investigation in their domain, and the critics placing themselves at maximum distance. They don't want to see anything, obviously. So for this talk, I begin to interview two art critics, Magali Le Sauvage and Claire Moulin, repeatedly, respectively for Mediapart and for Libération, and an editor at Le Monde. The first two ones confirmed to me that given the audience of the Me Too movement, the media chief editors have voiced and discussed their strong will to conduct investigation, which means taking time, a lot of time, in the journalist's words, and appointing writers for that. Magali and Claire confirmed their wish to take part to these investigations and to allow, within cultural discourse, form of speech and voices that were discredited. At Le Monde, on the other hand, every film critic vigorously refused, for instance, to investigate the recent screening at the French Cinémathèque of L'Astrango in Paris that was planned and programmed without a word about the conditions of its making. As you may know, in 1972, Maria Schneider, the actress, who was then a minor, she repeatedly claimed until her death in 2011 that the making of the film had destroyed her life and her career. What the director, Bernardo Bertolucci, and the actor Marlon Brando referred to as a sex scene was a rape scene, absent from the script, shot by surprise without Maria Schneider's consent. The director confessed in 2013 he wanted to capture on camera the reaction of the girl, not the actress, in order to evoke a real feeling of humiliation and rage. The French Parliament Commission reports, saying, "It's worth noting that this astonishing contradiction, while the authors are often protected in the name of their talent, the victims are portrayed as lacking it, since their emotions and their body must be sought without their knowledge and their wounds, traumas, or malaise, rather than their acting that must be used to find the rightness of their art." At Le Monde, it was an intern that did the investigation and wrote the piece. Film critics must have feared it would destroy authorship and cinema altogether. Maybe they were also threatened in their own claim to authorship and signature. In the ivory towers, sometimes constructed by critics who don't want to go there, who don't want to see, by opposition to journalists who do so, the former appear as aesthete and aesthetics have become disconnected with reality, and criticism is completely devaluated by not dealing with it. But why not? Why couldn't critics forge an alliance with investigative journalism to continue questioning their own practice in the face of realities? Both Magali and Claire told me it is about making alliances, working with people who know, for instance, the jurisdictional dimension, the societal dimension, who are acquainted with what question to ask, when to ask, how to ask, what to publish. And do these reality goes beyond aesthetic analysis? Can we imagine, but perhaps taking pleasure in works of art while maintaining a critical eye? Perhaps the task of the critic is precisely to make this ambivalence productive and to imagine an alliance, let's say, between cinephilia and feminist deconstruction. Such could be the role of art criticism. The excitement and pleasure of trying to uncover the implicit underside of magisterial certainties are surely greater than those of settling for a space of self-satisfaction in which the bourgeois ideal of freedom turns into a privilege. But how do we do that? That's my last sentences. I could offer a first lead found in a recent article published in 2024 in GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, entitled The Difference Queer Aesthetics Make, where Hantile Yap suggests a dialectical engagement between concreteness and abstraction, quoting Stuart Hall. Observing, theorizing, and abstraction are inseparable, writes Stuart Hall. Similarly, theory is never totally devoid of reference to the real world. What Marx says is that, in the first instance, any set of historical events presents itself to us as a mask of complex, unordered, and contradictory phenomenal forms or events. One has to break into them with the necessary abstractions. One has to cut into the thick texture of social life and historical experience with clearly formulated concepts and abstractions. The end result is what he called the production of the concrete in thought. Thank you.
That was unbelievable, and we actually have to go now. So to the bar.
I'm so sorry I was so long.
Hold on to your green stickers, because you can go to the bar. And thank you so much. I can't even start to say how amazing that was.
No.
It's amazing. Bloody hell. Bloody hell.
Oh, no. Come on.
That was generous. That was generous.
Oh, thank you.
No, it was generous. That was a lot.
That was a lot, yes. That was a lot, I know.
Thank you. I'm going to run now, but thank you so much. And we talk properly when I see you.
Okay.
Okay, darling. Thank you.
Great.
And
Bloody hell.
what?